What if I told you that one of the most influential psychologists in history, Carl Jung, identified a hidden but dangerous pattern in women, one that can unravel relationships, manipulate minds, and even destabilize societies? This isn't just about personality flaws or bad behavior. It's about an unconscious archetype buried deep in the feminine psyche, one that you've likely encountered in real life without even realizing it. Jung called it the dark feminine, and its effects are far more destructive than most people understand. Carl Jung, the pioneer of analytical psychology, believed that beneath our conscious minds lies a world of universal symbols and patterns, archetypes, that shape how we think, feel, and behave. Among these are the anima, the feminine side of men, and the animus, the masculine side of women, as well as the shadow, the repressed, often darker aspects of our personalities. But Jung also warned of a particularly volatile feminine archetype, one that, when left unchecked, breeds chaos, emotional warfare, and toxic relationships. Today, we're going to explore this controversial concept, why it's so dangerous, how to recognize it, and what it means for modern relationships and society. Carl Jung's exploration of the human psyche went far beyond surface-level behavior. He delved into the hidden forces that shape our deepest instincts, desires, and fears. Central to his work was the idea of archetypes, universal patterns embedded in what he called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological inheritance of humanity. Among the most critical of these archetypes are the anima and animus, representing the feminine and masculine energies within each individual, regardless of gender. The anima is the inner feminine presence in men, influencing their emotions, relationships, and creativity, while the animus is the masculine counterpart in women, shaping their logic, assertiveness, and intellectual drive. But Jung didn't stop there. He also uncovered the shadow, the repressed and often darker aspects of personality that society, or our own ego, forces us to deny. Within the feminine psyche, Jung identified a particularly volatile archetype, one that, when distorted or left unintegrated, becomes a force of destruction rather than creation. He referred to this as the negative anima or the terrible mother archetype, a figure echoed in myths and legends across cultures. Medusa, whose gaze turned men to stone; Lilith, the rebellious first wife of Adam who refused submission; the femme fatale who seduces only to ruin. These figures embody the shadow side of femininity, where nurturing becomes smothering, intuition becomes manipulation, and emotional depth becomes psychological warfare. Jung warned that when this archetype dominates a woman's unconscious, it doesn't just poison her own life, it spreads chaos to those around her, eroding trust, exploiting vulnerabilities, and leaving emotional wreckage in its wake. But why is this archetype so dangerous? Because it operates in the shadows, often disguised as charm, vulnerability, or even righteousness. Unlike overt aggression, which can be confronted directly, the dark feminine works through subtle but devastating means. Emotional vampirism that drains partners dry, a victim mentality that evades accountability, or seductive control that lures others into dependency. Jung observed that when this energy goes unchecked, it doesn't just harm individual relationships, it can warp entire social dynamics. A culture that either demonizes or glorifies this archetype without balance risks fostering generations of fractured connections, where love is replaced by power struggles and intimacy by manipulation. The real tragedy, Jung argued, isn't the existence of this shadow, it's the refusal to acknowledge and integrate it. Because only by facing the darkness within can true transformation begin. The manifestations of this dangerous archetype in real-world behavior are often subtle yet deeply corrosive. One of the most telling red flags is extreme emotional manipulation, where interactions become less about authentic connection and more about psychological control. This can take the form of relentless guilt tripping, where normal disagreements are twisted into moral failings, leaving partners or family members perpetually apologizing for imagined wrongs. Even more insidious is gaslighting, where the woman embodying this archetype systematically undermines another's perception of reality, making them question their own memories, emotions, and even sanity. These tactics don't just create conflict. They erode the very foundation of trust that relationships require to survive. Another hallmark of this archetype is a compulsive victim mentality, a refusal to take accountability for one's actions, no matter how damaging. Instead of acknowledging mistakes or working toward resolution, there's a pattern of deflecting blame onto others, often while adopting a posture of wounded innocence. This creates a dynamic where the woman is perpetually the aggrieved party, and those around her are cast as villains regardless of the actual circumstances. Over time, this breeds resentment and emotional exhaustion in relationships, as genuine issues are never addressed, only weaponized. Perhaps the most paradoxical trait is the presence of seductive but ultimately destructive charm. On the surface, these women can be magnetic, charismatic, emotionally intense, and seemingly attuned to the desires of those around them. But this charm isn't used to foster mutual growth. It's a tool for control. Relationships become transactional, with affection and attention doled out as rewards for compliance or withdrawn as punishment. The result is a toxic push-pull dynamic, moments of intoxicating intimacy followed by abrupt withdrawal or cruelty, leaving partners addicted to the highs but devastated by the lows. The psychological roots of this archetype, as Jung understood them, often lie in repressed trauma or cultural conditioning. A woman who has been deeply wounded, whether by childhood neglect, betrayal, or societal pressures, may unconsciously adopt these destructive behaviors as a means of self-protection. The problem arises when these coping mechanisms harden into a fixed personality pattern, where vulnerability is replaced by manipulation and genuine connection is sacrificed for power. In modern terms, this aligns with what some psychologists describe as female narcissism, not the cartoonish vanity of popular imagination, but a profound emotional emptiness masked by grandiosity, entitlement, and a relentless need for admiration. Jung feared that when this archetype proliferates unchecked in a society, it contributes to a broader cultural decay, a world where relationships become battlegrounds rather than sanctuaries, and where the feminine virtues of nurturing and empathy are overshadowed by manipulation and emotional warfare. He saw this as part of a larger imbalance, where the repression of healthy femininity, in both women and men, leads to its shadow counterpart running rampant. History and mythology offer stark illustrations of this archetype in action. Consider Medea, the ancient Greek figure who, betrayed by her husband Jason, exacted revenge by murdering their children. A horrifying example of how wounded feminine rage, when untempered by reason or compassion, can spiral into atrocity. Or Delilah, who used her intimacy with Samson to betray him, severing the source of his strength for personal gain. These stories endure because they tap into a universal recognition of this destructive energy, not as a condemnation of women, but as a cautionary tale about the perils of unintegrated shadow. Modern pop culture provides no shortage of parallels. From the calculating Cersei Lannister in Game of Thrones, who weaponizes her femininity to manipulate and destroy, to the real-life phenomenon of social media influencers who cultivate parasocial relationships built on idealized personas while evading genuine accountability, the archetype persists in new forms. What makes these examples so compelling is their ambiguity. They're rarely pure villains, but complex figures whose pain and ambition twist into something corrosive. This duality is key to Jung's insight. The dark feminine isn't some alien force, but a potential within every woman, and its danger lies in being unrecognized, not inevitable. The path forward isn't demonization, but awareness. because only when these patterns are brought into the light can they be understood, healed, and ultimately transformed. For men who encounter this dangerous feminine archetype, Jung's most crucial advice was to first look inward before attempting to navigate external challenges. The key lies in consciously integrating one's own anima, the internal feminine principle that exists within every man. When a man fails to develop this aspect of himself, he becomes particularly vulnerable to the projections of the toxic feminine, either being unconsciously drawn to women who embody these destructive traits or seeing them where they don't exist. A well-integrated anima allows a man to recognize manipulative behavior without being controlled by it, to maintain emotional boundaries without becoming cold or defensive. This means developing the ability to be receptive and intuitive without losing one's center, to be compassionate without being a doormat. Setting boundaries becomes essential when dealing with toxic femininity, but Jung would caution that this must be done consciously rather than reactively. Many men fall into the trap of either complete submission or aggressive rejection, both of which feed into the destructive dynamic. The healthier approach involves maintaining firm but compassionate limits, refusing to engage in emotional blackmail while still acknowledging the humanity of the other person. This requires a level of self-awareness that prevents being drawn into the drama triangle of persecutor-victim-rescuer, recognizing when one is being manipulated into playing a role in someone else's psychological script. For women who recognize these shadow aspects within themselves, the path forward involves courageous shadow work, the process of confronting and integrating the disowned parts of one's psyche. The dark feminine isn't something to be eradicated, but understood and transformed. This means examining the roots of manipulative tendencies, often tracing back to early experiences where vulnerability felt dangerous and control seemed like the only option for survival. Healing comes when women can acknowledge their capacity for both creation and destruction, learning to wield their considerable emotional and intuitive power with wisdom rather than wielding it as a weapon. The goal isn't to suppress feminine energy, but to balance its formidable power with compassion and responsibility. This balancing act requires honest self-reflection about motivations in relationships. Is the desire to connect coming from a place of authentic intimacy or from a need to control? Are emotional expressions genuine or performative? The healthiest feminine energy knows its own strength but channels it toward nurturing growth rather than domination. It's the difference between using emotional intelligence to understand others versus using it to manipulate them, between setting healthy boundaries and punishing others for having needs. On a societal level, Jung warned against swinging between extremes of patriarchal repression and matriarchal domination. Just as unchecked masculine energy leads to oppression and violence, unchecked feminine energy can lead to emotional tyranny and psychological manipulation. The healthiest cultures, like the healthiest individuals, find balance between these poles, what Eastern traditions would call the yin and yang. In our current era where traditional gender roles are being renegotiated, this balance becomes even more crucial. The solution isn't a return to rigid gender norms, but rather a more conscious integration of both masculine and feminine principles within individuals and society as a whole. When men can embrace their anima without fear, they become less likely to either worship or resent women. When women can own their shadow without guilt, they can express their power without destruction. This creates the possibility for relationships based on mutual respect rather than unconscious projection, where attraction comes from wholeness rather than neediness. Ultimately, Jung's perspective offers not condemnation but hope. These dangerous patterns only become truly destructive when they operate unconsciously. By bringing awareness to the shadow aspects of the feminine psyche, both men and women can transform potential toxicity into a source of wisdom and strength. The goal isn't to eliminate the dark feminine, but to integrate it consciously, allowing its formidable energy to be channeled into creativity, deep connection, and authentic power rather than manipulation and control. This is the alchemical process of turning lead into gold, not by rejecting our shadow, but by redeeming it. What we've uncovered today is perhaps one of Jung's most provocative yet essential insights: the dangerous feminine archetype that manifests as emotional manipulation, victim mentality, and seductive control. Far from being just an ancient myth, we see its modern expressions everywhere. In toxic relationships where love becomes warfare, in social dynamics where vulnerability is weaponized, and in cultural narratives that glorify destructive behavior under the guise of empowerment. This shadow aspect of femininity isn't about condemning women, but about recognizing a psychological pattern that harms both those who express it and those caught in its wake. This raises a crucial question for our times. Is this archetype actually becoming more prevalent in modern society, or are we simply more aware of it now? With social media amplifying extreme behaviors and traditional structures breaking down, we may be witnessing both an increase in these tendencies and greater visibility of what was once hidden. Perhaps the real issue isn't prevalence but recognition. As Jung warned, the unexamined shadow grows stronger in the dark. If this exploration of Jung's profound psychology resonated with you, show your engagement by liking this video. It tells us you want more deep dives into archetypes, shadow work, and the hidden forces shaping our relationships and society. We'd love to hear your personal experiences in the comments. Have you encountered someone who embodies these dangerous traits? How did you handle it? Your stories create valuable discussion for our community. For more transformative psychological content that goes beyond surface-level self-help, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Together, we'll keep bringing light to psychology's most powerful and often overlooked truths. Remember, the goal isn't fear, but awareness. As Jung famously said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. By understanding these patterns, we take the first step toward changing them in ourselves and in our world.